This is another webinar in the series on farm succession planning and helping farmers with succession issues. Just be on the lookout. Next month, we're going to be doing one on heirs property. That will be on April 20th. And then in May, we'll be doing one on family successor, and that will be on May 20th. So be on the lookout for those as well. But today we're going to be talking about conservation easements, and I know easements are really starting to gain popularity in the farming community. So, 5 or 10 years ago, it seemed like they were kind of a tough. I think the word has really gotten out about, and so we're glad to have some good speakers here today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brittany to let her take.
Okay, thanks y'all. Sound is good coming from my end. That doesn't mean I sound good. That just means you can hear me. So we'll go from there. Thank y'all much. So yeah, I'm Brittany Whitmire, and I'm an extension associate in the Ag and Resource Economics Department. You're going to hear a little bit later from one of my colleagues. But I have been assigned with, I shouldn't say assigned, tasked with representing FarmLink on some of its efforts or helping them augment some of their efforts. And one of the things that I've had some experience with is working with producers as they walk through the process of an easement. So from an agent's perspective, what I've been asked to do today is just hit some of the frequently asked questions that I'm sure both of our speakers, Evan and Andrew, will hit much more eloquently than me. But I'm sort of crashing you into some frequently asked questions to set them up, hopefully, for their presentations. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and get that playing. All right, enough about me. So the first thing I'll say is conservation easements are an awesome and potentially powerful tool that can be used in succession planning. And when we say succession planning, we really are talking probably more about estate planning in general for this, because really the easement is on one of the largest assets that people own, and that is the land. But alone, they're not a solution. So one thing that we as agents and folks working with our farmer and landowner clientele, we need to make sure that we're clear on that, and that, this is a tool. It's not a solution. It's not going to slap land in an easement and it answer all the challenges they have facing them with planning their estate or a transition of their business and or just the land they own. So the second thing that I encourage agents to help people think through is, how is the land that they're talking about possibly putting an easement viewed for this planning of succession or estate planning? And some of you may have attended the webinar we did a month or so, 2 months ago, I think. And I gave my spiel about, looking at land and how it is viewed from the perspective of the land owning generation. It might fit into one or more of these buckets. So for a going concern, a business that's going to transition from one generation to the other and that is dependent upon that land asset, it fits in that middle category oftentimes as a business asset, meaning without the land, the continuation of the operation as it is would not be possible. In some cases, we have, situations where the land itself or the business itself that the land owning generation operates is not necessarily going to transition, but the land may transition within the family, and they may do something different with it or on it or et cetera. And in that case, it often fits into one of these other buckets. It's a piece of retirement income that they had banked on, or it has retirement value, or it's literally something they're looking at as inheritance for the heirs. So, a way to transition that property. So it's really important for people to step back and think, and there is no judgment here. It's not good, bad, or indifferent, really. Or maybe I should say it's not good or bad. It is indifferent on how they view the land as an asset, but it's important to make them think about it for themselves, because once land goes into an easement, it is in perpetuity. If we're not talking about a term easement, and generally we're talking about a perpetual decision. So it doesn't just affect this property today, tomorrow, and next week. It affects it generations down the road. So that's the beauty of it, because it does protect that land, but it comes with a lot of thought that needs to be put into it beforehand. Okay, so that's my caveat on, yes, this can be a powerful tool, but use it carefully and judiciously. So one of the most common questions we get, and I'm sure Evan and or Andrew will go into this in more detail, but local governments, some state governments, and then various and sundry municipal and county governments may have the ability to hold easements. Most commonly, we hear about land trusts and sort of non-governmental organizations or nonprofits that are able to hold those. In North Carolina, some of our soil and water districts have the authority to. But an entity that is able to hold that easement is probably going to be one of those in that category. I get this question a good bit, and it's this idea of preservation versus conservation. Conservation easements are typically what we're talking about when we're looking at agricultural or working lands. You might hear about historic preservation easements on some of those lands if there's a particularly, an old or antique sort of building or structure that holds some sort of historical value. There could be a preservation aspect to the easement, but in general, we're talking about conservation. And we know, in our everyday lives, the difference in those two things. Conservation easements are intended on ag working lands to allow them to continue to be worked and used for agricultural purposes. So those have a few nuanced differences, but just keep in mind, if you hear somebody saying, well, I can't, if I put it in, I can't do anything, or that puts me under the preservation, not necessarily. So like any good economics answer, even the easement questions fall under that category of it depends. But in general, we're talking about conservation easements for our clientele. Does a landowner get money for an easement? Again, it depends. They can, and the options range from completely donating the value of an easement if they are in a position to where that's something they want to do, can do, and have an ethic that encourages them to make that donation. There are tax benefits, federal tax benefits that are associated with these easements that are in perpetuity. And as a special note, and Andrew may hit this later, we do have some term easements, which term just means a period of time that they agree upon these things, or they agree not to develop land. Term easements do not qualify for the same tax benefits that conservation easements in perpetuity do, for obvious reasons. But in general, there's a distinction there. There are funding agencies through which the entities that hold easements, sometimes they apply for funding and can use those funds to help pay for, possibly completely, but most of the time somewhere between 50 and 75% of the value. And that is generally known as a bargain sale. So there's some donation on the part of the landowner. There's also some compensation for the easement itself. And Andrew may talk about this legally in terms of how we think about an easement. When you own land, you own basically a bundle of straws, and some of the straws include mineral rights, development rights, etc. And some of those straws come out of the bundle, and that's what is paid for in the easement, because we take those away from what is able to be done with the land in perpetuity. We also oftentimes get people saying, well, how much is it worth? Well, it depends. But basically, the value of an easement is equal to the loss in market value after the easement's been executed. So you can think of a parcel of land is worth, and there are requirements in the process of appraisals, etc. But if you have assume a market value, let's, for easy math, say $500,000 is what this tract is worth. And if you put these restrictions on it, which the easement would do, and those depend on funding sources, the agencies that hold these, like how restrictive, the language of the easement is, depending on that, then what is the value of that land then under that easement? And the difference becomes the value of the easement. So, you know, you can make sense that maybe floodplain land wouldn't necessarily have as high value if placed in easement as, say, land that would be easily developed and, you know, just that's an easy way to think about it, but it always depends. But that's basically how that math works. And then lastly, on the FAQ part for the front end of this presentation, what costs are associated with it? So generally the landowner does have some expenses, and it depends on the process and the agency holding the easement, which pieces are actually their responsibility. And some of it might be offset by outside funding. So grants or external funding that would pay for some of those costs. But typically the grantor, which is the landowner, has costs associated with surveying, appraisals, maybe accounting or legal fees related to them getting guidance, you know, before this process, tax planning, and then preparing and recording the easement, because it hinges then on the deed for that property. Those are typically grantor expenses. The grantee costs may include some sort of baseline inventory and audits of the property, any legal fees. Typically there'll be a title search, title insurance, and then the perpetual costs of maintaining the easement, which they often refer to as stewardship. Those are all costs that are associated with the grantee. And stewardship in many cases becomes a shared cost. You know, the grantor will be putting in a bit of funding on the front end of the process, and then that's invested, and then the entity uses that to cover basically the costs of the long-term monitoring obligations and stewardship of the property. So that's on a real like 100,000 feet. These are some of the typical questions that I hope you brought with you, because I bet people have asked you these same things. And so our first speaker today is, look at that. He looks just like his photo. There he is in the box below me. So we've got Evan Davis, and he's the director of our Department of Agriculture's Farmland Preservation Division. And so I'm going to turn it over to him. I will stop sharing, and I will mute myself and say, Evan, welcome, and thanks for being here.
All right. Well, thank y'all so much for having me. And, you know, those questions were, they're right on point. I think we'll cover all of those. Probably, I don't have a slide on that last one about the costs associated. So if we do have questions about that, just bring that back up and we can dive deeper into the cost associated question. So the first few slides I have are really going to give us some good information on why farmland preservation is so important in North Carolina. These are things you already know. These are things that you're seeing in your communities, but it's always good to have some of that good data, you know, more arrows in the quiver when we're trying to make our case for preserving these ag lands. So we look at the American Farmland Trust for a lot of their research. They had two really great reports, really the most comprehensive reports on farmland loss in the United States ever. In 2020, they came out with a report that looked at what farmland was lost between 2001 and 2016. They determined that North Carolina lost the second most number of acres of farmland compared to any other state between that time period. 732,000 acres of ag land was converted. If you look at how it was converted, 78% of that went to low density residential development. And we'll talk about what that is on the next slide. And then in their study, they created a criteria called nationally significant land. And they took in a couple of different factors, most notably prime soils. But really, they looked at the productivity of the soils and determined that it took 2 to 3 times the amount of marginal land to make up for the productivity of nationally significant land. And so out of the ag land we lost during that period, they determined that 53% were nationally significant lands. So not only losing our ag lands, but some of our most productive lands as well. So in their criteria of low density residential development, it's a little bit of a sliding scale. Some of it refers to the construction of individual houses on large lots, and then also housing clusters and subdivisions that are in suburban and rural areas. Housing is obviously an important need. It's something that it continues to be an issue in North Carolina and across the United States. There is some short-term benefits with increasing the supply, but for our purposes, the long-term threats to farmland are very significant. This is an aerial photo from southern Wake County, and you can see the dichotomy in the land uses. And obviously, what was going on that land before they put in that subdivision. So, low density residential development, again, it's pretty broad in its definition, but I think we pretty much know what that is, especially driving through the suburban fringe and out into the rural countryside. This map shows the areas they identified of ag land lost between 2001 and 2016. The red areas are where those were converted from ag lands to non-ag uses. So as you can see on this map, not a lot of surprises. But if you notice some of the red areas closer to the darker green areas, the darker greens are areas they identified as nationally significant land. So this is very important when we look at strategies for resource efficiency. Where should we be putting these dollars? And that's certainly a criteria that we should look at in the future. Now, their next report, this is the one that everybody has hopefully heard about. We've been spreading the message along with all of our partners across North Carolina. But in 2022, they released their next report looking at farmland loss projections out to the year 2040. They had 3 models in their report. Business as usual, this looked at current development trends. Runaway sprawl, it increased the amount of low density residential development by 50%. And then better built cities, it looked at reducing low density residential development by 50%. So based on current development trends, we're on pace to lose 1.1 million acres of farmland by the year 2040. With increasing sprawl, that could go up to 1.6 million acres. And the best case scenario still isn't very good on paper, but the more compact, closer, dense development, looking at a projection of 661,000 acres. Now, this report is very interesting because they go down to the county level. And so there are 3,100 counties and county equivalents across the United States. And North Carolina, unfortunately, has 4 in the top 40 out of all those 3,100 counties. Johnston, when you're looking at potential ag land loss, they're number 19 in the country. Union is 23rd. Wake is 32nd, and Iredell is 38th. Then you look at percentage to be lost. So in other words, how much is left in the county? How much could we lose there? Well, North Carolina ranks 6th in the nation in that category, but we're the only state outside of New England and the Mid-Atlantic. So again, not only losing the numbers in mass, but also what we have left in the counties. And so they did provide some economic statistics behind this. So looking at the loss of 1.1 million acres, that would be the equivalent of 9,100 farms lost, a reduction in 1.25 billion in farm output, and almost 20,000 jobs lost. And then, sometimes it's kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around the scale of what we're talking about. So if we look at the runaway sprawl model where we could lose 1.6 million acres of farmland, if we compare that to the entire landmass of the state of Delaware, we are going to outpace the entire state of Delaware at 1.5 million acres. So here is a true projection of our 2 states. So there is 1.5 million acres in the purple outline, the state of Delaware. So again, that is what is at stake. Again, this is looking at where they think the development will go. And so again, out from the urban and suburban areas, but there are lots of pockets across the state where they're looking at farmland to be lost. Okay, so that's the stakes. That's why we're here. What can we do about it? That's what we're going to talk about next. So I'm with the Farmland Preservation Division. The mission is in the name. But the biggest program we have is the Agricultural Development and Farmland Preservation Trust Fund. It is a grant-making entity. We provide grants to county governments and conservation nonprofits, most notably land trusts. We provide grants for a few different things, but over 90% of our grant awards go to agricultural conservation easements. So just a quick rundown on our responsibility. We're in charge of administering this program all the way from application to post-award monitoring. Obviously, working with partners like Cooperative Extension to enact farmland preservation strategies across the state, and then working with those local programs like the voluntary ag districts, which you're more than likely familiar with. This is just a quick graph that demonstrates what we're looking at today. The hierarchy of farmland preservation is as you move up the pyramid, you increase the protection for the land while also increasing the financial incentives for the landowners. So obviously today we're looking at the top two rungs of the pyramid. And Brittany made a great point about the preservation versus conservation. One thing that we're working to do on our staff is to be mindful of our language. We want to say agricultural conservation easements, because those are the primary purpose of these easements. There's all different types of conservation easements. They have different objectives. Some may be focused on a specific species or endangered species or wildlife protection, riparian buffers, water quality. We're focusing on agricultural production, and that includes forestry as well. So like Brittany teed up earlier, a couple of those questions that come up are listed on this slide. Now, once people find out about what this program is, our first question is, how much are we going to get paid for this? And we'll talk about those numbers here in a little bit. But yes, we do provide grants that provide direct payments for the purchase of development rights and also the costs associated with building the agricultural conservation easement package. Now, one thing I really want to emphasize is that we are doing nothing in fee simple. We're doing nothing with land transfers, nothing with condemnations. This is a voluntary program, and this helps to protect private lands and keep them in private hands. And so it's important to understand that these easements run with the land for the length of the term. So the majority of the easements that we provide funding for are perpetual agricultural conservation easements. So there's a great phrase that I've heard. I've been stealing it ever since I heard it. Those are in effect as long as the flag is flying. So it is a heavy decision. I know Andrew's going to talk about some of those important details when thinking about estate planning and farm transition. And the crystal ball is very hazy. But we have to think about this for the current ag operations, the will of the landowners, and then what these can do for the land resource going forward. So 2 quick slides. We're going to talk about the restrictions first and then what rights are retained. So these are the primary restrictions of the agricultural conservation easements. Residential development, that's restricted, but if you notice, I put a little asterisk beside it. There are some allowances for residential construction, and we'll talk about those on the next slide. Commercial development, this refers to commercial development outside of agriculture and customary rural enterprises. So things that don't fit into those 2 categories are going to be restricted. Subdivision of the property. I know Andrew's going to dive into this quite a bit, but this is a very important concept because once the easement's recorded, the boundaries cannot change. You cannot subdivide the property after the easement's recorded. Now, if you're going through the process where you have an appraisal to determine the value of the easement, you can customize the boundary. So you can go within one parcel. You can cover more than one parcel. You can have more than one easement on one parcel. You have that flexibility there, but you cannot subdivide after the easement's recorded. Mining is a restriction. We want to maintain the topsoil for the production of food and fiber. Dumping and trash, obviously environmental concerns. Commercial signage, this really refers to billboards. And then military partnerships. We work with the military. We have compatible use between our 2 programs. We want to maintain farms and forests. They want to maintain airspace and training areas and base encroachment buffers. So we can work together on these projects, provide funding from both sources, but they have their own restrictions. These include large towers, upward facing lights, anything that might restrict the military's training capability. All right, so like I mentioned, the land remains in private ownership. So what rights are being retained? You have the right to privacy. You can still enforce your trespass. These do not grant public access to the land. The only time there's going to be access is for the annual monitoring compliance visit. Brittany mentioned stewardship and monitoring earlier. This is with advance notice, and it's going to be with the easement holding entity and any of the funding partners as well. Obviously, right to farm. It's important to note that you can change allowable uses on the land. So if we take the most extreme example, you could clear cut the forest and turn it into a pasture and then go back and plant trees. As long as you're within one of those allowable uses within agriculture, horticulture, or forestry, you can do that. Obviously, the right to harvest your timber, right to customary rural enterprises. This is obviously very important with today's agricultural operations, the need to diversify. So agritourism is allowed and it's encouraged. Ecotourism, that's also allowed. I talked about the asterisk with residential construction. So these easements allow for the construction of residential buildings and also any type of structure that is pertinent to the ag operation, agritourism, or other customary rural enterprises. The caveats to it, you must have that language in the easement, and the areas in which you build must be delineated on a survey, and these are called farmstead building envelopes, and they're designated by these uses. So state law says these easements can have up to 3 residential building envelopes included in the easement. There's a lot of details that go with this and a lot of thinking that has to go into it. And we can work through that process when we're consulting with landowners. It can be a little bit complicated, but once you understand the concepts, it's easy to provide this information to landowners. Hunting, fishing, bird watching, hiking, all these types of outdoor activities, low impact is the key word. Those are allowed. And then you do retain your water rights. All right, so here's what we've done so far. We've recorded 5 easements so far in the calendar year, so that pushed us over 35,000 acres, 234 easements across the state, of which 224 of those are perpetual. And really the reason for that, the funding levels, which we'll talk about on the next few slides, and also the tax incentives. There are no tax incentives for term conservation easements. And we've had easements in 53 out of the 100 counties. All right, so here's the big question. How much am I going to get paid for this agricultural conservation easement? We've broken these down by our funding regions across the state. So on this table, you'll see those regions, then the average per acre conservation easement purchase value, and then the low and the high. So you can take a moment and take a look at these, and we'll talk about how these are calculated in the next couple slides. Here's our funding regions for your reference. And then based on what those are, the easement purchase values, we do have an average percentage of fair market value after easement. All right, so what does that mean? Here's the best way to think about it. We'll use easy math on this. If you have a fair market valuation of $100,000, and let's say you're in the North Central region, you use that percentage of 40%, and you would have a 40,000 valuation after the conservation easement. So the difference between those two values, 100,000 fair market value, $40,000 value with the conservation easement, the difference between those two is the easement purchase amount. That's $60,000. So this is a great reference if you're trying to do some napkin math with landowners. Again, these are based on actual closed projects across the state. So again, this is a visual of how that easement purchase is determined. So again, looking at the fair market value in this example, we're using $225,000. we're using that 45% in this example. That gives us an easement value, the value of the land with the easement of 101,250. So the difference is 123,750. That is the maximum compensation for a landowner on this particular example. All right, what are the funding options? Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, with the trust fund, we do provide funding for conservation easements. Most go through our standard appraisal program. However, we do have a PUV value program. So present use value is the basis for the easement purchase amount. There are some different restrictions with that program, but they're both great options for landowners. And really, it can be dependent on where you're located and what your uses on the land are. We have a counterpart program with NRCS. They have their standard program, ALE, Agricultural Land Easements. And then they also have the regional conservation partnership programs. These are geographically based programs. And so it's a great way to focus in on certain areas for these funding sources. Like I mentioned, we work with the military. Right now, we're working with the Air Force and the Navy and Marine Corps in their priority zones. One of the great developments in the past year or two has been county level programs. So counties are getting on board with providing funding for these conservation easements. So we're able to work with them if they have the same type of objectives of preserving farmland. And then landowner in-kind donation of value. That's what I mentioned with the tax incentives. Right now, there is a federal tax deduction. And so it's important to understand that we always must finish the equation, so to speak. So in that previous example, when we looked at the $123,000 of easement purchase, if you don't have that full value in cash considerations from funding sources, you still have to finish the equation. And more times than not, the landowner provides that in-kind donation of value. That is what is eligible for the federal tax deduction. Here's just another example of how funding sources can work together. This is a example one from the Western region. We saw that easement purchase value at $7,200 an acre. At 50 acres, that gives us an easement value of $361,000. Through our appraisal program and NRCS's programs, either through ALE or RCPP, they can provide 50% of the value. So here we've split the pie in half. So that'd be the maximum compensation a landowner could receive in this example. All right, so here's an action item. You have an interested landowner. Now what do you do? As I mentioned before, county governments and land trusts are recipients of our grant funds. They apply on behalf of landowners. If awarded funds, they build the conservation easement package on behalf of the landowner. And then once it's recorded, they become the easement holding entity. The easement holding entity is, for lack of a better term, the enforcer of the terms of the easement. But really, we want to think about this as a partnership between the easement holding entities and the landowner. Cooperation will get you a lot farther than that strict term of enforcement. And so I have a couple of maps here. So a common question that's received, well, who can we go to? This first map shows the soil and water conservation districts. They are our most frequent applicant on the county side. The ones in blue are current easement holders. Most of these, the authority or the project management comes through the Soil and Water Conservation District, but the county may be the actual easement holder. There are a handful of standalone conservation districts across the state, but I'd say most of these are going to be listed as the county on the easement. The three in red are those county easement holders, so they may or may not go through the Soil and Water Conservation District. The ones in green are currently under contract for a conservation easement with us. They haven't completed it yet, but they're in progress. And then we did receive Pasquotank as a brand new one in this past application cycle. Land trusts, most of them are regional across the state. These are the ones that we have worked with. So you can see how they're broken out across the state. Some do split counties, so it's important to reach out to them specifically on which areas they service in the county. There are a handful of statewide land trusts, so they're able to work in any of the counties across the state. But unfortunately, there are some holes in the map, and there are not any regional land trusts in the counties in white. So again, the best thing to do is to reach out to the land trust and see what their current capacity is for applications, and if they're working in a particular service area. All right, last couple slides here are the final pitches for agricultural conservation easements. So again, these remain in private ownership. You have voluntary landowners that are coming to the table, and it's important for county governments to understand that concept, because the majority of the easement applications we receive, the land is enrolled in present use value. These agricultural conservation easements allow them to remain eligible for present use value. So that means it's revenue neutral for the counties. It's not taking anything out of the tax base. Again, going back to the concept of the purchase of development rights. So it's a little bit of the best of both worlds. They're getting paid for a particular property right, but they still own the property in fee simple. We've talked about the tax deduction. Another tax advantaged situation is a 1031 exchange. And we hear this quite a bit, that landowners are buying more farmland with the proceeds from the agricultural conservation easement. Now, one thing early on in the process, it's very important to talk with landowners about what type of lien is on the property, if there is one, because you have to talk with the lender and make sure they're okay with either whatever the payoff agreement would be or a subordination agreement. So in other words, the easement surviving in the case of a foreclosure. Without one of those two, we can't go forward in this process. Another thing that's very important is that the proceeds for the purchase of development rights is a taxable event. So landowners need to talk with their accountants or tax advisors on the best way to handle that situation. But again, across the board, what we hear most commonly, the landowners are paying down debt. They're expanding their operations either through the purchase of property or more equipment, or they're setting things up for what Andrew will talk about next in farm transition. One new initiative we have are agricultural growth zones. This is an effort to target specific areas and counties for conservation. Research has shown that if you have areas of conserved land in big blocks, those are one of the most effective tools for sprawl mitigation. So we're encouraging counties to put up money for agricultural conservation easements. We'll try to match that 1-to-1, and then they can direct the funds at a local level. This locally driven approach, we think, will be a great thing for county governments, and we have our first applications for those. So we're very excited about this. Here's one thing that I don't need to go into much detail with y'all today, but this quote is it's right to the point. I love it so much. Food requires agriculture, agriculture requires land. That's really the crux of what this whole program is. We have to have the land resources for agriculture now and in the future. Commissioner Troxler was happy to announce last year that agriculture in North Carolina is a $103 billion industry. So we have to have these land resources to support our top industry. And then, of course, the environmental benefits. We know what great stewards of the land that farmers are, and there's all kinds of great benefits. One of the important restrictions in these easements are impervious surface limitations. So this is a limitation on the amount of structures or paved roads, anything that rainwater cannot penetrate. There's going to be a restriction on this. And if we know what has happened in the past few years with hurricanes and these big rain events, the runoff, the flooding down east, we think this is just such an essential piece to help slow down some of those negative impacts. So again, we know what the environmental benefits are of having working farms and forests, and this is just a tool to make sure they stay that way. And so that's all I have. I know there's a lot of information thrown at you there. I'd be happy to provide this presentation to the group. and obviously happy to answer any questions y'all may have.
Okay, and while we're making a transition, I would encourage you, if you've got some questions specific to what you heard from Evan, to put those in the chat. I just looked and didn't see any. And I would encourage you to do the same thing as we go through Andrew's presentation. In terms of, let's see, here we are. Let me make this look prettier. There we go. In terms of setting up, hopefully, Andrew, for the last half of this session, here are just these are really will be reminders, because Evan hit a good many of these. Does an easement mean public access to my land? That's one of the real common questions I've had from folks when we've sat down and talked about this as a potential option for their family. And as Evan said, only if the conservation easement's purpose is in fact for public recreation, then it does not guarantee public access to the property. So physical public access is generally not required unless the conservation element that you're conserving is something on there about public recreation. And in the vast majority of our clientele, that's not the case. Now, in some areas, they do a conservation element might be the scenic or preservation of rural, some sort of scenic aspect, which might mean that the attribute, while their physical access wouldn't be granted, they would still be able to like park and look somewhere. But in general, unless there is something related directly to public recreation, public study, or scenic scenic preservation, then you can ease people's minds that nobody can just be traipsing around on their property. And in fact, as Evan mentioned, generally speaking, I think pretty much all the cases I've ever heard of, when a land trust or a soil and water, whoever has the easement, plans to come and do a stewardship visit, there's usually communication, beforehand to set up a time, because they want to be able, that person might not be the same person that was in that role when the easement was put in place, because obviously personnel change. And oftentimes they want to be able to, see the thing with you from the 4x2, side by side or truck or whatever. So the vast majority of times I've ever known or heard people talking about when they had their stewardship visit, it's been a positive one. And it was, in terms of they knew it was happening and they made plans for it accordingly. Another question, which Evan already discussed, but can my land be further development? That's another thing that it depends on what exactly you mean by further development. He referenced the envelopes. That's a common phrase you'll hear. And effectively what that means is if you look at a map and there's a little carved out section, that's the non-technical term for it. If in the process and in the preliminary work part of this, there's pieces that are carved out, that can qualify as these envelopes, which he means on which a house could be built for, let's say, a kid or a grandkid, or whatever the case may be. But that's a really important piece. And when I sit down with a family in the role of sort of a succession coordinator, one of the first things, not in the very first thing, one of the second or third things that comes up, is, okay, let's look at the scenario here and build the family tree, if you will, and or outside members that aren't necessarily natural family members, but are a part of this farm or business or its future. And, a lot of times part of that plan is I'm going to carve off 5 acres for this non-farm heir, and I'm going to carve off, there's a need for some sort of land aspect or asset to be passed to an heir that might not have direct involvement in the farm. And so in those situations, unless that's discussed, talked about, acknowledged, and built into what land goes in the easement and what land doesn't, then that can be a limitation down the road if you haven't talked about that beforehand. So again, it's kind of like people want to hurry up and wait, right? This idea they've heard about, they're ready to do it. And part of my job when I work with a family is to slow the roll and really think about, okay, let's talk about the things that maybe are a little uncomfortable that we haven't wanted to talk about, like daughter Susie or daughter-in-law or son-in-law, whoever, they don't want anything to do with this, but they have they're planning on coming and building a retirement home here one day, a home for their retirement one day. Those are all very important pieces that we as agents, if we have people asking us questions about conservation easements, I encourage you to, help them think through some of the dynamics of their family, some of the dynamics of their business. Again, think about those buckets that I showed earlier. Is this land transitioning as part of an overall business that's going to continue in the next generation? Or is it transitioning as an inheritance asset? Or is the current owner generation dependent upon it for retirement? And if so, is it transitioning as one main landmass versus subdivided parcels? How does that impact what they plan to do in the future? So anyway, that answer is it depends. For the most part, agricultural activities that don't create impervious surface that exceeds that threshold, or that cap, I should say, not threshold. Most of the time, rural enterprise, like you said, you got maybe a dairy and they decide to build a creamery. Now the roof would become part of an impervious surface, etc. But many times those cottage or rural based industries that are directly tied to the farm and its production are allowable within the parameters of the language. But that's what's really important to think through, not only what's happening on the farm today, but what they envision might be possible on the farm in the years to come. Okay, I got 2 more questions for you, and then we're going to turn it over to Andrew right on time. Who enforces the terms of an easement? Evan mentioned this already. I hinted at it in the stewardship FAQ, but who holds the easement? The agency or the entity or the organization that holds the easement. They have attorneys on staff or on retainer. And when there is something that is outside the language of the easement, that is addressed, etc. And we do have examples where, in fact, I'm working with a family right now who purchased property that had been placed in an easement with the previous owner. And it's a little bit challenging because they are pursuing an agricultural enterprise on it that is directly related to the previous, farm venture that the previous owner had. But the land trust that currently holds that easement is much more preservation than conservation minded. And so one of the efforts that I've challenged my colleagues on, especially with FarmLink and maybe even with the department, is reaching out to these organizations that hold easements and helping advocate, basically, and helping to educate on good practices. When our farms are using best management practices that are environmentally sound, productively sound, etc., we hope that these easements will allow them to work as long as they're not going against any of the language in the easement. We are trying to be resources for them in working with entities that hold easements that aren't as conservation minded and more preservation minded. So I say that not in creating a stir, but also it's important who holds the easement as to the purpose of the easement. So working agricultural land in an agricultural conservation easement seems to be the best fit. And hopefully those organizations understand the needs of the producers. And then lastly, should I even consider this? Well, you've heard a lot already, and you'll hear some more from Andrew. But in general, landowners can consider this a tool in the toolbox as they think through, the ethic they have for their property, as well as the needs that they have and the expectations for using that asset. But they should think about them carefully and with perpetuity of impact in their minds, because, easements are tied to deeds, other than the term ones. And Evan, you saw that pyramid. We were looking at the 2 top sort of lines or boxes on the pyramid, and that very top one, which is the permanent easement, that's in perpetuity. And so that means those limitations are placed on the property now and for generations to come. And so a lot of our landowners, they know mostly the intentions of the next generation. They might have a slight idea about the next, but what's beyond that, there's no way to really know. But the important part comes maybe more so if you have folks who are just significantly interested in ensuring that that land is still available for working land and ag production in the future. And that is an ethic that they have, and they're able to make that fit within the needs of their estate planning, then sure, this may be a really powerful option for them. Okay, so our next speaker is not a stranger to any of y'all, I don't think. If he is, now you know. If you didn't know, now you know. Andrew Brannon is a colleague of mine in ag and resource economics at NC State, and he's our farm law guy. So I'm going to turn it over to him. And interestingly, just for kicks, part of what brought Andrew and me together is this particular, not conservation easements, but succession planning and looking at these as tools as it relates to farms planning for the future. Back when I was an intern in grad school, and he was with an organization that focused on farmland transition. So it's fun to introduce him and say, you're up next. And make sure you come off mute, and I'm going to stop sharing.
There I am. Hey,
Okay.
everybody. I'm not a stranger, and maybe the more y'all hear from me, the stranger y'all think I am. So I can share, right? Here's my presentation. Most of y'all already know about this. Can y'all see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
This is my web portal, farm law for producers and landowners. You can just Google farm law at NCSU. Every time I have an opportunity to, particularly with extension agents and directors, please sign up for emails. I try to get something up each week, but the extension IT people put the blast email out at 11 a.m. on Mondays. But all my presentations, all the writing, all the stuff that Brittany was just saying, you know, what I do in my appointment, the law stuff is all in here. And so this presentation that I'm going to give, I have filed it here. You can do it by, you can find anything on here by just searching in the search bar. But this is part of a presentation. It's really part 3 of 1 that I did at the invitation of, I'm gonna hit a timer. I'm gonna be with y'all, I'm gonna do 9 minutes. As part of a program that the North Carolina Soil and Water Foundation did for conservation districts to help them with their technical capacity to start holding more easements. In addition to land trusts, soil and water conservation districts in the county are able to hold these easements, and more are doing so, and they're sort of working through some of the challenges. What I'm going to focus on today is the relationship between the conservation easement and succession planning or state planning, and just raise a few key points. Maybe ask a couple of questions of Evan. And a lot of these things have been covered. And so that's been covered. Here's where I'll start. You know, Brittany was addressing that last question about, is this something right for me? This is a decision that's, it ranks up there with one of the most important that anyone can make. Because often this is the largest representation of wealth in their family portfolio. And so to enter into this process is one never ever taken lightly. And that, I think that becomes very evident to landowners as soon as they start interacting with either Evan's group or with the land trust or with the soil and water district, because they look at, you know, this is what this process is going to entail. It's going to be a long one. There's going to be a lot of moving parts, a lot of due diligence and such. But for estate planning purposes, and again, I'm doing this in the realm of first and foremost the estate tax, the federal estate tax. We don't have one in North Carolina anymore, and these are just highlighting some of the benefits that folks might perceive and be able to organize in their estate planning. And this is a big if for us, a lot of our clientele are in a space of wealth where they are not, even one individual in a marriage is not exceeding that $13.6 million in wealth. That's the level at which heirs do not have to pay a tax on the estate inheritance. That will sunset that amount at the end of 2015. So for folks that die in 2016. If Congress and the president don't act, it will go back to $5 million. And so for folks in peri-urban areas, that will, if the law doesn't change, that's going to, that'll be somewhat of a concern for those needing to preserve wealth by not paying federal taxes. Conservation easement can help. In the Internal Revenue Code, we still have a deduction, or I'm sorry, an exclusion from the taxable estate value that an executor can make. It's under this 2031C, and it's capped. Essentially, if you have a conservation easement on the land, and again, this is a permanent one, not one that expires at a certain date, then you can take up to $500,000 off the value. And again, imagine that we're talking about a pie that if it's large enough, part of it might be taxed. We may need to reduce the size of that pie in order to get it south of a tax. I know I'm spending a lot of time on the slide, but there are possible other income tax liability reductions, particularly for working farmers or qualified farmers, as they're called. But the easement can provide, the easement sale can provide cash in, state class session planning. And I've seen this done. I've seen really all of these done. Purchase a whole life insurance policy that then provides cash for those that aren't going to be inheriting the land and taking it on as an operational asset. Distributing cash, setting aside cash for a share for other children. Paying down debt, purchasing more land, as Evan mentioned. However, though, and I'm saying however down here, we don't have any research on, over the 30 years that we've been doing this. In my career, it's been 20. I sort of got my start in this stuff. What is happening to these properties after in the years following in these conservation easements? I got a call just the other day from someone in North Durham County. It was a lawyer. My name was in a trust that the family had. It was a former client. And two people are inheriting the land, and it's in a conservation easement. And as Evan noted, that conservation easement cannot be subdivided. And so that's just, I'm very interested in what happens ultimately with these properties. How is this wealth used, or this wealth conversion, this wealth realization used, really, in this process? I'm sure I just said that. Present use value, there's benefits also for permanent easements. I think that, this is going to be well, I'm not certain about that, whether this includes terms, but it can automatically qualify your property for permanent PUV, meaning you no longer have to have the ag income requirement. Still have to be a certain size qualification, but if you put a conservation easement on the property, you can go to the appraiser and say, hey, I've done this. I would like my property reappraised. It does qualify for what we call an off-cycle reappraisal. But you have to have, the landowner has to have donated at least 25% of that conservation easement value, meaning they didn't receive it in cash. And so that's just another benefit. The general effects, and here's where I'm going into this area, I get in 3 minutes, to point out one of the fundamental opportunities with conservation easements and succession planning, and that's what I call pre-subdivision. Because as Evan has pointed out, as Brittany has pointed out, once you enter into this conservation easement, most language in the most standard conservation easements that everyone uses, the land trusts and soil and water conservation districts, has one simple line that says there will be no further subdivision to this property. And that's pretty much it. It's not a if this or if that. It's a very simple line that prevents subdivision. There are various tax reasons for that, particularly for the nonprofit land trust holding the conservation easement, because they are not generally allowed to modify private transactions that otherwise benefit the public, which is what the theory of conservation easements. And so, but the subdivision restriction is one. Defeating partition rights if there's two owners. This is an issue that I don't really have much research on. and whether a clerk of court could even order a subdivision thwarting the conservation easement. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure no. So what if the 2 or 3 or 4 siblings that inherit this land can't agree on what to do with it? One of the only options, if one of them files a partition action, would be a forced sale of the entire tract. 2 other key things to keep in mind: impervious surface restrictions. This is going to get towards that issue of how much can you build on land that has a conservation easement. Generally, the standard is that impervious surface, which are paved roads and roofs, can't be more than 2% of the total area. I'll have a map that shows that. And also the question comes up often, does this defeat eminent domain? I think the answer is no. In fact, conservation easement deeds provide for that eventuality or that possibility. And they even have a formula in there for how the proceeds from that condemnation action are going to be divided between the landowner, the state and federal governments who've provided the money, the land trust who's holding it. It's just I don't really remember the language, but it's in there. And I say, what circumstances may a conservation easement be modified? It's not, once the easement deed is in place, I would argue that there's some legal theories that have been floated out there by scholars on whether it can be done. I've not seen it done. It doesn't mean it can't by a court action. A court can pretty much do whatever it orders. So there's my timer, and I just didn't stick to it. Principal challenges in succession planning, again, is going to be the asset distribution scheme. In my experience, when I was in private practice, is that most families divide up their assets equally among their children. I'm using the word children. I'm talking about people in their 50s and 60s when they inherit it. But you can, and here's the big reveal of the presentation. You can, in advance of going into the conservation easement process, and I mean very far in advance, design what I'm calling a subdivision scheme to basically lay out how this property could be subdivided in the future. And without going into, this is, as y'all saw, it's on the website, so you can see the details if you're that curious about it. The private benefit doctrine, that's why the land trust can't modify these easements. Don't need to go into that. I know in the week. So here's one. So Ag Development Trust Funds rules, Evans Group, they contemplate, land division. And as Evan mentioned, that you can't reserve more than 3 housing lots. That's not a subdivision issue, or 3 housing sites. That's not a subdivision issue. That's just that's an impervious surface issue, because you can build those 3 residences on that parcel of land, but you can't subdivide it. You can't take that one house and maybe subdivide off 5 acres and then that be its own parcel. I'll raise an issue with that in a second, but just the ADFP manual contemplates a subdivision. The big work in this, the North Carolina statutes, the general statutes, contemplates it. So we know that it's a thing. Here's the big one, is the NRCS. If you're getting money under the ACEP program, the ALE program, the Agricultural Conservation Easements, ACE program, sorry. It's possible. In fact, that I'm just, with all these words, you don't have to read it, but I'm putting it out there that there's pretty detailed instructions in the NRCS manual, and even in the language of the proposed deed, which I'll put here, that provides several options. And again, this is something when the landowner goes into discussions with the Soil and Water District or the land trust, or as Brittany identified, some other entity that holds easements, then this is something that has to be addressed early and does require professional assistance, because you are laying out a map, so to speak, of how this property is going to be subdivided. Remember, as a state matter, at least as the rules of the state funds, minimum of 20 acres. And so I'm just cycling through some slides here that just show that we have guidance from this from NRCS, and that each of the subdivided parcels have to still match that impervious surface requirement. Meaning you can't have all the buildings on one parcel and then everything else is okay. The state director of NRCS has the authority to waive that 2%, but as you can see here, no more than 10. And let's do something that's more fun than all these words. Okay, real quick. I put this in here in the context of succession planning because there was a question that came up in one of the trainings that the Soil and Water was doing a year or so ago, and somebody said, "Well, this is a long process. What if somebody that's pretty aged wants to go into it?" Yeah, sometimes folks don't survive the transaction. They pass before the transaction is completed. Generally, the way these transactions go is that early on in the process, the landowner signs an option agreement with the land trust, giving the land trust the right to continue the transaction, even over the protest of the heirs. And I say, how's that done? Well, a court. You'd have to go and get a court order forcing them to proceed. But there are ways that you can build into trust language, powers of the trustee to do this transaction after the person is passed who owns it. I put in some sample trust language just to give folks an idea of what that looks like. This is here authorizing the trustee to go ahead and qualify for that 2031C estate reduction process. Here's some maps just to demonstrate. I was privileged to do several conservation easement transactions in private practice. One of the things I want to note, and Brittany brought this up, is that the land trusts particularly that are enforcing conservation easements, and this is going to apply also for the conservation districts who have the county attorney at their, as their legal enforcer, so to speak. A lot of these land trusts do have lawyers that they're lawyers in the sense that they're members of the state bar. They're not necessarily serving as general counsel for the land trust, but they're the ones that are working with the landowner. I always caution landowners, it's not that they're working against your interests, but they're not working for your interests. Their value is knowledge of these transactions and how to move them along, coordinating NRCS and the ADF, PTF. But I encourage folks to, talk to counsel earlier in this process. Generally, lawyers don't get involved in this transaction with the land trust until closing. And that's way too late to raise any of these particular issues. The reason I have these documents, and the reason I have sort of maybe a different view of it as a private practicing attorney is I was privileged to work with one of the land trusts who didn't have a lawyer on staff, and so I did a lot of the legwork. I did the baseline photos. I did a lot of the show. I did maps like this one where I'm calculating the impervious surface in order to demonstrate, as a matter of public record, that it falls under the 2%. Requirement. Just some calculations to demonstrate. And again, this is the type of thing you will see, and maybe I would call it part of due diligence that goes into developing this transaction, is that you are doing a lot of mapping and pointing out different features in the landscape that we want to, sometimes required to stay in place, but that we want people monitoring the easement to be aware of as they're looking at what's the activities that the landowner might undertake as they continue to farm and use this land for production. Here I've noted building envelopes, and again, this is an exhibit in the public record attached to an easement. But you see here's farm buildings, farmstead buildings, whatnot. No resident. There might be a residence in here. But that's why I want to raise a challenge, is that if you're doing this in a family with more than one heir, but you have been somewhat attracted to the process by the promise that you can have multiple residential building envelopes. As Evan noted, you can have 3 under state rules. The challenges, and this came up recently with an easement and north of Wake at least, where the second generation was ready to build the house that the easement was permitting them to do. There was a building envelope. The challenge is that they don't own the property and can't get financing for the house. So unless you have the raw materials and the cash to pay the labor to build the structure, you're not able to subdivide off that building lot and use that as independent collateral to finance the construction loan. And that's a real issue. And I think in this case, their lawyer was calling me and asking me, I think what we came up with ultimately is that the landowner had to go ahead and make the other person a co-tenant, or I think they might have even just added the next generation to the deed to make them a co-owner. Now, what this does, though, it also puts the senior generation into the bucket of that financing arrangement. Because you remember, you can't just carve out an area here and get financing to build on just that area. This is the collateral. It's the entire thing. And if it's still owned by mom and dad, they're going to be signing that deed of trust. I don't, there's no promise, or not the deed of trust. Yeah, sure. If it's a building loan, promissory note, I'm not certain on, but for certain the security instrument that goes in the chain of title. I realize this is super duper technical. Just I wanted to kind of illustrate in real life how, you know, the promise of a building envelope really needs to be thought through. And I'm becoming a little bit evangelical about this. I want families to take advantage of conservation easements. I want us to protect these soils and pervious surfaces for our groundwater recharge and water quality. But I also, if it's going to benefit the family, to consider filing a subdivision plan and getting it approved prior with the state funds and with the federal funder before going into the transaction. Like, for instance, here, there's a road here that probably exceeds 20 acres, I would imagine. This probably exceeds 20 acres. This probably exceeds 20 acres. And so that might be a plan, that, is filed in terms of how this property may be surveyed out and parceled out in the future. So instead of one big conservation easement, it's really 3 conservation easements, but still with the same restrictions and same requirements and all of that. I've gone way over the time that I allocated for myself. Y'all can look at this at another time. I threw up made some timelines about how this might go down depending on when a senior person, somebody of senior in age, goes into this transaction to protect the land and whatnot. And that's me. There's my email address, and that's it. Comments, questions? Everybody still there?
Yeah, so if you have any questions or comments, feel free to unmute and into the chat. We'd be glad to try to answer those. Also, I want to go ahead and do a poll before everybody jumps off, just so we'll be sure to have it done. If you go ahead and answer those questions, that helps us out. Just